turn it over to you.
Okay. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Jnanam Janasarakaya Chaksurmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Nam Vishnu Paraya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Iti Namani Shri Varshavani Vide Naitai Kripabdaye Krishna Sambandha Vikyana Daini Prabhave Namaha Madhuri Udvala Premadya Shri Rupani Bhuktida Shri Gaura Karuna Shakti Vigrahaya Namostute Namaste Gauravani Shri Murte Vinatarani Rupanuga Virudhapa Siddhanta Dhanta Harene Jai Sri Bhaktisiddhanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Jai Bhakti Rakshak Shri Radha Goswami Maharaj Ki Jai Shri Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura Prabhupada Tirubha Mahamotsav Ki Jai Thakur Bhakti Vinod Ki Jai Bhakti Vinod Parivar Ki Jai. So it's nice to be with all of you on the occasion of the Tirubha of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. That is the day in which we are remembering the departure from the world of the great Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. Of course, we use words such as disappearance, departed. Departed is more common, disappearance not very common. I remember when Prabhupada, quote unquote, disappeared from the world, one of my godbrothers called the newspapers and told them that A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada had disappeared in the world, and they asked, where did he go? So a little explanation for the general public is required, or perhaps a different use of words, but Tirubhav, disappearance, of course it means that he has departed from our mortal vision, but not in terms of our capacity to be connected with him. And so on days like this, we emphasize that fact that we are coming members of the Bhakti Vinod Parivar, as he referred to his lineage, to this day, even being nourished by his teaching, by his example, by the results of his great campaign in the form of Pujapat Sridhar Maharaj, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, and other spiritually advanced Vaishnavas who are in the present nourishing us. So it's an auspicious occasion to remember him and try to say a few words about his life and teachings, his emphasis, and so forth. Most of you are familiar to some extent with his life. I have said before, and perhaps worth repeating, that my acquaintance with his life, of course, is through his disciples, and three of them in particular have had an influence upon me. My initiating guru, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, my Siksha Guru Bhakti Rakshak Shri Radha Goswami Maharaj, and another Siksha Guru, to an extent, Bhakti Pramod Puri Goswami Maharaj, each of whom are, of course, disciples of Bhaktisiddhanta, and each of whom I learned or gleaned something about Bhaktisiddhanta from. And in the broad sense, I gathered from my own Prabhupada, Bhaktisiddhanta being referred to as Prabhupada affectionately by his own disciples. One time, this reminds me of an occasion, that Prabhupada arrived in Buffalo, New York, upstate New York, and his assistant, who told me this, was unpacking his bags, and amongst his belongings was a photo of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And Prabhupada, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, looked at his disciple who was looking at the picture and wondering exactly what to do with it, where to put it. And he said, put Prabhupada over there. Mm. And it was a bit of a epiphany of sorts for that assistant disciple to hear Prabhupada refer to his Prabhupada, to put Prabhupada over there when he referred to Bhaktisiddhanta Swami's Prabhupada as we did. So point being that Prabhupada had his own Prabhupada, if you will. And as much, I would say, as Prabhupada's students and grand disciples and so on and so forth have a considerable amount of reverence and awe for A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. He's such a large figure, if you will, in terms of his broad campaign and literary contribution was considerable. Many of his disciples even never spoke personally with him other than to receive mantra from him. Some of them didn't receive it directly from him, but through tape recordings of the mantra that he extended initiation through the medium of. There's a few, some of his disciples never met him personally, never saw him personally. So given the magnitude, if you will, of his campaign, there was quite an air of reverence for him, his Aishwarya, his greatness, and so forth. And through him, I gathered the same sense of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura. He had extraordinary measure of reverence for Bhaktisiddhanta, whom he met only perhaps personally, collectively, a number of days, about 2 weeks, a day here, a day there, 2-3 days there, that he personally spent in his company. Most of his time was spent outside of the mission, for that matter, of Bhaktisiddhanta as a householder, rather than in the mission as a monastic, living directly under his personal day-to-day guidance or the guidance of one of his the leaders of his mission, one of his sannyasis or administrators and so forth. So Prabhupada had great reverence for Bhaktisiddhanta. And it was interesting to see, because we had such reverence for Prabhupada, and to think that there was someone that he had that measure of reverence for himself really put Saraswati Thakur up on a pedestal, as he should be, for all of us. At the same time, it didn't share with us that much about him personally. Prabhupada was not prone to speak very much about Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And I think that, again, that his regard for him was such that even the thought of him caused very strong spiritual emotions to rise within him, and made him unable to speak at length. So that's one window, if you will, that I was afforded into the person of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and then through Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj, whom I later had the good fortune to come in touch with. I learned more about the mission of Bhaktisiddhanta, details of how it was run, how it was organized, some of his the details of Saraswati Thakur's strategies and innovations and whatnot. And so it was a more kind of an insider view of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur as the commander of the mission, and the way he dealt with circumstances, and the nature of the focus, I should say, the particular emphasis of his outreach, his preaching, and so forth. And that was kind of a closer look, if you will, it's like stepping inside of the moth, of which, of course, Gaudiya moth consisted of 74 different moths or monasteries, 64 moths or monasteries throughout the subcontinent of India. We have to come back to that and emphasize how what the measure of that campaign was in light of Gaudiya Vaishnavism in relation to the rest of Gaudiya Vaishnavism was considerable, and in relation to Hinduism as well. But before we do that, the third, as I say, window through which I got a glimpse of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was through the company and service of Association of Promote Puri Vaishnava Maharaj. And as I've mentioned before, that he joined the mission earlier than Prabhupada and Pujapad Srila Maharaj. And what struck me in hearing him speak about Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was the measure of affection that he had for him, and the measure of affection that Saraswati Thakur had for his disciples. And of course, this was mostly with disciples in the moth whom he was overseeing their lives and so forth. But it was very, very touching to think then about the greatness of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, kind of the majesty of him, his Aishvarya, the power of his campaign and so forth, which can create some distance on the one end, and on the other end of the spectrum, in terms of these three glimpses, if you will, into his life, we have Pramod Puri Maharaj, whose emphasis, at least when I heard from him, was about the affectionate dealings of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur with persons like himself in the mission, caring for them personally, making sure they were fed, and so on and so forth. This is then my the mediums through which I became acquainted with Saraswati Thakur. Subsequently, of course, I've read things that he's written, and I've read things that have been written about him. And let me refer to some of those and give some historical context to the Thakur's life. Of course, it's hard to speak, if not impossible, to speak about Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur without speaking about Thakur Bhakti Vinod. And Thakur Bhakti Vinod, of course, was the father of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and he himself, Thakur Bhakti Vinod, has written about his own lineage, family lineage, I guess called genealogy, dating back to one Purushottam Datta. Datta was his family name, Kedarnath Datta. Bhakti Vinod Datta was a very common name in Bengal, as was Day, and Datta. They made up most of Calcutta at one point. Purushottam Datta relocated from somewhere I don't know, at the request of the king at the time in West Bengal. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur's, that takes Bhaktivinoda Thakur's family lineage back 25 generations. Interestingly, I think, and notable for us, is the fact that the 15th generation of Purushottam Datta was a Raj Krishnananda, and he was the father of Narottam Thakur. So in the family lineage of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, we also find the Kayasta, if you will, Narottam Thakur, whose campaign was also very broad, very wide. He was the initiated disciple of Lokanath Goswami, and as far as we know, the only initiated disciple of Lokanath Goswami. And by contrast, he had many, many disciples and traveled widely, especially in Manipur area. Um, and he was, anyway, in the same lineage. It's interesting that his campaign was wide. Of course, Bhaktisiddhanta Thakura's campaign and that of Bhaktisiddhanta and his followers has been quite wide as well. But Thakur Bhaktivinoda himself married, had one son, I believe, and his wife passed away. He married again to Bhagavati Devi, and with her he fathered about 12 children, I believe, the sixth of which was Bimal Prasad Dutt. So that is the family name, the given name, birth name of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, who was born in Jagannath Puri, where Bhaktivinoda Thakur was residing at the time. And on the main road of Puri, where the Rath Yatra proceeds annually, in his home there, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was born. He's named Bimal Prasad. Bimal is a name for one of the Shaktis of Jagannath. So named after Jagannath and from the Shakti perspective. And at the time, Bhaktivinoda Thakur was, of course, a practicing Vaishnava. I have, in other discussions, described Bhaktivinoda Thakur as the first Western convert to Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And I say that because he had his considerable acquaintance with the West, Western philosophical perspectives, scientific perspectives, modern, coming from Britain and the Americas as well, and also political acquaintance with the political systems and so forth, different religious traditions. And he was very prominent in the mix of the Bhadralok, which was a kind of a collective of pious, intellectual, and artistic Hindus that were becoming acquainted with, familiar with traditions outside of their own. Again, scientific insights, political traditions, religious traditions, and so forth. And so this was a community that was very much involved in rationalizing their faith. Something that happened in Europe in relation to Christianity earlier on, when insights from Aristotle, I believe, came forward as to that might have been in contrast to the way people were believing based on the biblical narrative and so forth. And so they had to theologize and rationalize about their faith and bring intellectual integrity to their faith. So this was much of what was going on in the Bhadralok, and Bhaktivinoda Thakur was a major player in that. He was close with Rabindranath Tagore, for example, who was the father of the famous Rabindranath Tagore, the poet, Bengali poet who met with Einstein. So Calcutta was at the time the kind of the capital in the outside of Britain of the British Empire, and it was a very cosmopolitan place. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur was a prominent person in that group. And his son, Bimal Prasad, also became very prominent and a leading intellectual within the Bhadralok, even at an early age. The title, we don't refer to him, of course, by his birth name, given by Bhaktivinoda Thakur, but rather neither, for the most part, by its initiated name in one sense. We'll get to that, but by the epithet Siddhanta Saraswati. Interestingly, that was bestowed upon him in about 1889 or 1890. He was born in 1874, I believe. Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Gorkishore, who were his two gurus, were born earlier in the century in about 1838. I think they were born the same year. So born in 74, by 1889, Bimal Prasad, because of his intellectual prowess, ability, insights, I should say, in terms of his work with astronomy, was given the name Siddhanta Saraswati by prominent persons in that field. So it was an acknowledgement of his own genius. He was quite involved in that astronomy, and also became a controversial figure in that realm, positing his own ideas that contradicted some that were prominent at the time. That's an interesting subject in itself, astronomy and the Puranic perspective, and then the Western perspective, and in between the two, the Surya Siddhanta, and so forth. We won't go into that in depth, but at any rate, in that particular field, he was recognized for his intellectual insight and given this title, which stuck with him, to which later on he added Bhakti, and that became his sannyas name. We'll try to speak a little bit about that, but suffice to say that in his youth, he was a standout kind of a young man in terms of his intellectual insight, and he was also a Gaudiya Vaishnava from birth, unlike his father, who had a conversion experience. Bhaktivinoda Thakur had flirted with the Brahma Samaj, with Christianity, and other currents of thought at the time, and ultimately, upon examining carefully the Chaitanya Charitamrita and the teachings of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself, he became a great devotee of the Bhagavad, Srimad Bhagavatam, and its teachings as understood by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So he had a conversion moment, which it seems was a surprise to many people in the Bhadralok, because at the time, Gaudiya Vaishnavism, Chaitanya Vaishnavism, was not seen as really much of a candidate for a religious perspective going forward in the modern world. Now, it's important to try to understand these times, because Gaudiya Vaishnavism was there as a tradition, but what life was about, what the world was about, was very much up for discussion amongst pious intellectual Hindus in the Bhadralok. And the conversion of Bhaktivinoda Thakur was extraordinary. And what he did with that, which was basically to say and to work towards convincing others that going forward, Gaudiya Vaishnavism had intellectual and moral and spiritual integrity in the modern world and beyond, the borders of Bharat, of India. So just to emphasize, the times were very fluid. Ideas, it was a time of ideas and thought. And Bhaktivinoda and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, as a young man, like his father, both of them were very acquainted. They were very in touch with the world. They knew the political pulse of India, of Britain, other sectors. They knew that they were acquainted with the philosophical thought of the time, leading thinkers, writers. They were acquainted with modern scientific insights. They were acquainted with different religious traditions and so on and so forth, which is probably unlike many of those who have been converted themselves to Gaudiya Vaishnavism in the international community and in India today. The extent to which they were familiar with the world and kind of plugged into it while being completely plugged into Gaudiya Vaishnavism is considerable. And this was necessary for them to do the kind of outreach that they ultimately did. The idea for which coming in Bhaktivinoda Thakur's Puchpat Chudamani used to say, and the shape of, and giving shape to that idea, as Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur did with his mission, the Gaudiya Math. So anyway, as a young man, he was a luminary of sorts, and he was a Gaudiya Vaishnava. Unlike his father, he was not converted, but he was born into Gaudiya Vaishnava. Even in his youth, he wrote poems about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and his father, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, gave him japamala that he himself had chanted on to chant on, and I think he imparted the Nishringa mantra to him as well. At the time, notably, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, although a Vaishnava and a convert, had not accepted initiation. He had not found his initiating guru. And this is an interesting point, and it carries over into Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur as well, whose initiation was, in terms of the formalities, initiation by Gaura-Kishore, different than what had come to be kind of the norm in terms of the formalities. Or to speak then of his acceptance of sannyas, which was done in to use a term, an unorthodox way. He was given Harinam by someone who was not initiated, Bhaktivinoda Thakur. But it's worth pointing out here, it's important, I think, to point out that as important as Diksha is, initiation is, I've likened it to planting seeds, Siksha being watering, and you can't have one without the other. At the same time, its importance is relevant to one's own, for oneself at least, relevance for ourselves, relevance to our own, relevant to the measure of our own conditioning. After all, it's meant to help us move beyond our material conditioning. And in his Bhakti Sandarbha, Jiva Goswami makes the point that Nam of Krishna, which is Nam different from Krishna, is fully capable in and of itself of liberating anyone. And the Krishna mantra, which is basically made up of Krishna's names in the dative case, given that that is the heart, the names of Krishna, of the Diksha mantra, it similarly is capable in and of itself to give one, take one beyond the constraints of material existence and more. And unlike, speaking of the Krishna mantra, the Gopal mantra, unlike other mantras that need to be empowered in order to have power, they are inherently powerful, given that, again, that they consist primarily of the names of God. And so if someone, the point is, and Jiva Goswami makes this point that I think indirectly, is beyond the constraints of material existence, or considerably beyond, having been involved in such, for example, Gaudiya Vaishnavism for previous lives and so forth, then the extent to which the necessity of the guru is significant will be lessened, slackened, will be less. The guru is a teacher and an example. If we ourselves have been well taught or well learned from the past in previous lives and are a good example, and it's hard to reason otherwise about both of them, Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Bhaktisiddhanta, and particularly Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, who Bhaktivinoda sometimes, I believe, referred to as the ray of Vishnu that he prayed for to help him in to give shape to his ideas of widely disseminating the teachings of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So, born in the Vaishnava family, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he received initiation from Thakur, who was not Harinam, who was not initiated. I wouldn't slight that or dismiss that because Bhaktivinoda Thakur was not initiated at the time. Given who he was and what he was doing for Vaishnavism even before being initiated, that's not to minimize his initiation, and he never did himself. And he expressed having undergone some measure of transformation after being initiated. But let's say like this, Bhaktivinoda Thakur was not a new devotee. And he had some considerable background. Many people in his party bar like to think of him as a Nityasiddha and of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur as well. Although Thakur Bhaktivinoda himself described himself as a sadhana siddha, and that seems more realistic. But a sadhana siddha who in this life has Kedarnath Datta, and then Bhaktivinoda Thakur, a title that was given to him, the Bhagnapar Vaishnavas, in the line in which he came. He was anyway an extraordinary spiritually qualified person. You have to look at the qualifications. Let's take, for example, the character of a person. Let's take Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. We can find Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in the scriptures if we look carefully, and that through the lens of the Gaudiya Vaishnava founding acharyas themselves, who have found him in the Bhagavatam. It means to say they found verses that they say refer to him, and their logic and reasoning about it is good. No one before them ever did that. Of course, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu had not appeared prior, but the references to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu are subject to interpretation, and they have been interpreted, those verses, in other ways. But the person of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, that cannot be denied. The fact that he was an embodiment of love of Krishna, and that the holy names of Krishna were so transformative in his life, and contagious for that matter, in terms of how through his example, which he primarily taught, if you will, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was not given to public discourse. He gave private discourse to Rup Sanatan, as we see from Chaitanya Charitamrita, and then they gave public discourse in the form of their literature, Rup Sanatan, Jiva Goswami, and so forth, which was expansive. But he himself was not giving public discourse. He was listening to public discourse from Gadadhar Pandit. He very much set an example of being a student, being a devotee, rather than being a guru and a teacher, although he was in his Acharya Leela, Krishna in his Acharya Leela, he was teaching by example, and it was his ecstasy, if you will, was contagious. So, if the scripture, my point is, doesn't say that he is a bona fide devotee or an example of prem bhakti. And so then there's something wrong with the scripture. You have to find a way in the scripture to support that obvious fact. Goswamis have done that, which is more or less an academic exercise. But had they not done it, it would not have stopped people from joining the ranks of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, becoming his follower, and so forth. They legitimatized it that much more in the broader sector of the Hindu community and those who needed that kind of support. Nityananda Prabhu didn't need that kind of support. Before anything was written about who Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was, he advocated that while Chaitanya Mahaprabhu taught his friends, followers, community to chant the names of Krishna, to follow the teachings of Krishna, and so forth, Nityananda Prabhu taught them to follow the teachings of Gaur, chant the names of Gaur, and so forth. So he identified him as Krishna just without bothering with scriptural support. So the point I'm making here is that the personal character and the devotional qualities that we find in Bhaktivinoda Thakur and that we find in Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, these override any formalities that may not have been entirely in place that one could point to. For example, the one I'm speaking about now, Bhaktivinoda Thakur gave Harinam initiation effectively by giving beads and a prescribed number of rounds to chant to his son, Bimal Prasad, without having been initiated himself. That's an irregularity. We could dismiss the whole event if it weren't for the fact that Bhaktivinoda Thakur was who he was in terms of his own extraordinary character, in whom, for example, we find things that we don't find in his initiating guru, not to dismiss or in any way minimize his guru, but to emphasize the extraordinary spirituality of Thakur Bhaktivinoda. And the same holds true with his son, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. Not only was he recognized in his youth for his intellectual insight, but also for his spirituality, which really began to manifest when, at the direction of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he sought out who would become his initiating guru, Srila Gaur Kishore Das Babaji Maharaj, who, in contrast to Bimal Prasad Dutt, was not educated, was from, I believe, a mercantile family, and the Kayastas, the Dattas being Kayastas, was a kind of a peculiar caste, if you will, that was clerical in terms of occupation, but also rose to being teachers and Brahmin-like, so to speak. But the mercantile caste that I think maybe from a cloth merchant's family is different. And in that family, Gaur Kishore Das Babaji Maharaj appeared, took birth. He became the great mystic and renunciate that we know him to be, perfect in his Krishna consciousness, yet relatively speaking, illiterate. It is said that he kept with him in a sack wherever he traveled the Prem Bhakti Chandrika of Narottam Thakur, which in Prabhupada's, my Prabhupada's language was, or in his comment on such book and other works of Narottam Thakur, the Thakur took the sophisticated Vedanta and Gaudiya Vedanta and put it in simple Bengali language that lends itself to song and so forth. So Prem Bhakti Chandrika, like that. And we sing Shri Guru Charana Padma, a song that was instituted in ISKCON to accompany the Guru Puja of its founder, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. Prabhupada comes from Prem Bhakti Chandrika. So it's in a way it's a simple uh, text, and it does focus on many very basic points and also higher points, but was the simplicity of it, in terms of its presentation is what I'm emphasizing. It's not like a real heady kind of philosophical doctrine. And this is what the Thakura carried with him. We say he's illiterate. I don't think it meant that, I'm speaking of Gaura Kishore Babaji, the Babaji kept with him. And we say he's illiterate. I don't think that means to say he couldn't read. Maybe he couldn't read, but I find that a little hard to believe. But he wasn't educated, and in comparison to Bimal Prasad, he was an illiterate from a merchant's family, but of course a very exalted devotee. But the contrast was something that really stuck out in the mind of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, because Bimal Prasad, because Bimal Prasad was a desirable entity. Many people wanted him to be involved with them, to have a connection with him. Again, he was named Siddhanta Saraswati. He was given a title, a very exalted title, for his intellectual insights in a particular field, and his moral character was unquestionable. He formed a group, forget the name of it, in an early age, I think at about 17 or so, and the group all part of the vow to be the group was the vow of lifelong celibacy. That's a pretty big vow to take at 16, 17 years old. And I don't know how many in the group were able to live up to that, but the young Bimal Prasad, who became the great Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, of course, lived up to that his whole life. That's speaks to his moral character. Not that it's immoral to have a family or anything of the sort, but his control, his sense control, and stout, as I say, moral character. So he had a lot going for him. And at the same time, when he met Gaura Kishore Das Babaji Maharaj, what stuck out in his mind is that he was himself a desirable entity and had a lot going for him and could have been someone in the world of considerable renown. But those qualities that he had, in and of themselves, they afforded him no purchasing power for that which he perceived was driving the life of Gaura Kishore Das Babaji Maharaj, which made the Babaji oblivious to the world and living in it, but not of it, practically speaking, without necessity of the world. He, to give an example of that, I mean, for his clothing, he would retrieve cloth remnants from cremated Hindus, wrap himself in that. For his eating, he would do things like this, and take a bowl of dal and soak it in the Ganges overnight and eat that. So he was extremely renounced. Not that his renunciation and austerity was a means to his ends, but his Krishna bhajan, his absorption, his love for Krishna, had produced this kind of a result in him, of being oblivious to a large extent, and independent of worldly support. And so there was a riches, a wealth in him, that of Vaishnavism, of praying, that was clearly visible to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and he understood that despite his own good qualifications, they in and of themselves, as I say, had no purchasing power for the wealth that lived and swelled, flowed through the heart of Gorkashodas Babaji Maharaj. And it was that wealth that he ultimately wanted. I mean, he was an intellectual, he was religious. Now he of course sought the initiation from Gorkashodas Babaji Maharaj, who was close in a sense with Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and that he would Bhaktivinoda Thakur was a preacher. He would give discourse and so forth. After he was initiated, in particular, he would give Vaishnava discourse, and Gorkashodas Babaji Maharaj was often in the audience of his discourse. So he was fond of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Gorkashodas Babaji Maharaj, and the son, Bimal Prasad, is one whom he gave shelter to. Now, I mentioned this before, and here it comes up again. The initiation that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur received from Gorkashodas Babaji Maharaj was lacking in terms of what was formally kind of developed as the details of what imparting the mantra in Gaudiya Vaishnavism consisted of. And I say details because let's look, say, for example, at Hari Bhakti Vilas. In Hari Bhakti Vilas, the Gaudiya Vaishnava initiation is described, and I believe the Gopal Bhatta Goswami or Sanatana Goswami gives 3 different procedures. Do this, and if you can't do this, do that. And if you can't do that, do this. And the last of them is give the mantra, share the mantra. That's the essence of it. Whether you have a fire yagya or if you have witnesses, whether whether there's a piece of paper that Diksha Patra, Diksha letter that speaks about it, and so on and so forth, or not, or whatever other procedures, different paribars or lineages within Gaudiya Vaishnavism have adopted, is secondary. Imparting the mantra is primary, and along with that, that the person imparting it is a person of substance. If, I like to think, the initiation that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur received from Bhaktivinoda Thakur lacked certain details at the time that were prominent, probably devised by the Goswami families, caste Goswamis, who were prominent initiators, household men and women, system that they had come up with, if you will, with details. If that, and it appears to be the case, was lacking, then the initiation lacking details should not be placed on Bhaktisiddhanta as being defective on his part, but you have to place it on, if you want to call it defective, you have to call Gorkashodas Babaji Maharaj defective. So some people like to criticize Bhaktisiddhanta. He didn't receive a Diksha Patra, he didn't receive this, that. They don't know, they weren't there, but there is a historical controversy about it. And it appears that there may be some truth to the fact that some of these details were not in place. But he should not be blamed for that. Gorkashodas should be blamed. Nobody should be blamed, really, is the point. Because there was an essential spiritual transaction and connection between Saraswati Thakur, Bimal Prasad, who became Bharsha Banabi Devi Daita and I think he added the das to that. Shri Varshavanavi Devi Daita. So one of his pranam mantras mentions this name, Shri Varshavanavi Devi. What is it? Shri Varshavanavi Devi Daita. Kripabde Krishna Sambandha Vijnana Daine Prabhave Namaha. So this is the name that he received. So he received the name from Gorkashore Das Babaji Maharaj. I believe this she will stop referring to him as Bimal Prasad, even going forward as we are historically here. Shri Varshavanavi Devi Daita. It's a name for being a maidservant of Radha, basically. Varshavanavi Devi is Radha Daita Das, the servant of Radharani, who, the pranam says, was an ocean of mercy and who delivered others by dissemination of the sambandha about Krishna. Krishna Sambandha, Vijnana, Daine Prabhave Namaha. So I think the Thakur has himself said, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, Sri Varshavanavi Devi, Daita Das, he said that Gorkashore Das Babaji Maharaj told him that you will realize your Bhakti Swarup, your prospect for Leela Seva, which means giving shape to your praying and personality and so forth, through the syllables of the Hare Krishna mantra. Whatever else he said, whatever else he shared with him, we don't know, but according to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, this is something that he shared, Gorkashore Das Babaji shared with him at the time of initiation, and something that Saraswati Thakur emphasized. He had a great faith in the Maha Mantra and Sankirtan. And his depth in terms of Gaudiya Vaishnavism was very much combined with the breadth. We have to go back for a minute and think of the time, the circumstances, a very fluid time in terms of thought and whatnot that he was involved in, and the idea of sharing Gaudiya Vaishnavism on the world, the stage of the world religions, putting it there for consideration and so on and so forth. This is the breadth, the wide, expansive distribution that he was involved in at the request of and the behest of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. In this, in consideration of that, there was a strong emphasis on Nam Kirtan, which was the main practice of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself. We see that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu received Hare Krishna Maha Mantra and a form of the Krishna Gopal Mantra, 10-syllable form from his guru, as described in Chaitanya Charitamrita. He engaged in Nam Sankirtan. It drove him mad. So that was the method to his madness, and his Madhya Lila turned into his Anti Lila. His public persona turned into private persona, incapable of functioning and relating to the external world as a result of Nam Kirtan. So the famous statement of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur corresponds with this reality that we see in Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who is Krishna himself teaching and showing the way to praying. That statement being, Kirtana Prabhave Smarana Swabhave, that by the power of Kirtan, Smaranam, which is central to Raga Bhakti, will develop. In other words, the mind will be captured by the power of Kirtan. And that's the goal of yoga, to capture the mind. And because the names of Krishna, of course, are empowered but with a Shakti, Nam Namakari Bahuda, as Mahaprabhu said, Nija Sarva Shaktis. The mind will be captured, not in a limited sense, as it can be through yoga, which is difficult, but in an easier way and more comprehensively. The example, of course, being, yogis try to remember Krishna, the gopis try to forget about him. They can't. How much their mind is absorbed in him. Trying to forget about him and give him up, given who he is and the way he disappears from them at times. They can't, they try, but they can't give him up. So the extent to which the mind will be captured and smarna will result, and this then together, smarnam and kirtan will give rise to an internal reality. The internal reality of Bhaktisiddhanta that arose out of this was not only I am in the broad sense, the servant of Varshabhanavi Devi, but I am Nayanamani Manjari. So a Manjari identity arose out of that. And so the depth of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was realized through his emphasis on kirtan and the breadth also, because obviously it's the kirtan is something that everybody can do. Smarnam is not something that everybody can do on day one. Some form of smarnam, everyone can remember Krishna as best they can and so forth, but dhyan, dhruvanusmriti, samadhi, these are results before they are practices, if you will, and results of practice, which then become a practice and bring deeper results, but they cannot be practiced. You can just practice samadhi or practice dhruvanusmriti and so forth. So his emphasis on, as his guru told him, was on kirtan. Of course, he, as we know, he was an innovator. And again, we have to reflect back on the times in which he was living and the place for that. And he formed a mission to give shape to the desire of Bhaktivinoda Thakur that Gaudiya Vaishnavism would be spread widely. And he emphasized, rather than secluded bhajan, which was the norm for advanced devotees, they would gravitate towards that, live in the dhams and so forth. He emphasized kirtan in a dynamic form of kirtan as a means. In other words, instead of sitting in the jungle and meditating on Krishna, which is not so easy to do, he suggested that his students absorb their minds in trying to articulate and disseminate the theological truths and insights, which are extraordinary, of Gaudiya Vaishnavism to the common people. That's very consuming to do that. You have to understand what they are, and then you have to translate it into common language and perhaps express it, points of it in relation to other thinkers who people are familiar with, to give them some point of common ground and so forth. And it has great potential to consume the mind. So his dynamic idea of kirtan included the printing press and prachar, dissemination, discussion of the core teachings, and also an emphasis on the core teachings in the sense that without imbibing the core teachings, and by that I mean, as he would say, bhajan is performed on the platform of Advaigyan Tattva. So having risen above duality of material existence, one is in a position to really meaningfully, deeply participate in Smartam. So an emphasis on um, important kind of basics of Vedanta, and less emphasis on the details of the Prayojan Tattva. Not that they weren't there, but um, this was characteristic, I would say, of his mission. Again, by the force of kirtan, Smartam will come about naturally. Now, that's another discussion about how that teaching may have been abused over time now, and there needs to be a corrective, and so forth. But such is the nature of ongoing succession and the shelf life, if you will, limited shelf life of any particular preaching strategy that one might come up with. There were some number of preaching strategies that Saraswati Thakura came up with, which were relative to the time that he was in. One aspect of which was dealing with the modern world, British, other philosophies, the religions, and dealing with other traditions within Hinduism and Varnashram and monism of Shankar in particular. The Varnashram had a hold on people, and the Smartas, who were the religious sector of the Advaitin mystics, if you will, they had much of a hold, a monopoly on religious practice and to a fault, so much so that the Varnashram of the time, social religious system of the time, was termed, I believe, by Bhaktivinoda as Asura Varnashram. And he asked his student, his son, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura, to re-emphasize what real Varnashram is. Now, if you think about that, that's important, even in our times today. Not so much in terms of its need to be instituted or the possibility of that, which seems remote, but because the caste system, if you will, is one of the most misunderstood things about Hinduism that you could find. And the one thing that stands out more than anything else as a reason to reject Hinduism altogether. And this is what Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura was against, this misunderstanding on the part of Varnashramis themselves of what Varnashram is. One of the key points there being that the quality and the character of a person should determine their Varna rather than their birth alone. So if you're all born in a certain family, your destiny is locked in. You cannot change. You're going to go beyond that, and so forth. This is, in just a very broad sense, essentially what was wrong with the Varnashram community at the time. That, and of course, the fact that it thought itself to be the be all and end all, and dismissed Vaishnavism as being some lesser path, and Gaudiya Vaishnavism in particular in Bengal. So these were problems that he confronted, and so he had some interaction with the Varnashram system and so on and so forth. But in one sense, that Varnashram is really just presenting what the Bhagavatam says Varnashram is about. It's very clearly stated in the 7th canto of the Bhagavatam, of course, that one's Varna one's Varna is determined by their character more clearly than it is stated in the Gita, where it's also stated. People find ways to override that clear statement and interpret it otherwise, but it would be hard to do so with the statement found in the Bhagavatam in the 7th canto. Forgive me for not being able to recite it at the moment by memory. But this was another of the currents that he was dealing with. So his innovations are in his preaching strategies were hatched in that time and the consideration of the time. And we, in his Paribar, in the Bhaktivinoda Paribar, as he referred to his lineage, need more to be as innovative or insightful and fluid, if you will, as he was, than to be attached to or insistent upon details of his particular strategy in his time, and then unfortunately, as some do, misconstruing them to be principles that need to be in place at all times, and so forth. So, a very dynamic preacher. He, of course, began his mission, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, at the request of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Gokashodas Babaji encouraged him not to preach. Bhaktivinoda Thakur wanted him to preach widely. He ended up following Bhaktivinoda Thakur's advice and starting a mission. And there's historically verifiable evidence that he himself began initiating in the presence of Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Gokashodas Babaji Maharaj, who obviously did not object to that, took no exception to that. So if you want to find support for the lineage coming through Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, we need look no further than Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Gokashodas Babaji Maharaj. If you want to argue against that, as some persons in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, who the Thakur was seeking to revive, to focus more essentially, and to engage in light of the modern world being at their doorstep in Calcutta and so forth. He was a controversial person. Some people took exception to his critiques of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, which was being critiqued by common people. You'll find today, unfortunately, some foolish persons who really don't understand the history or are not focused in a spiritually essential sense, questioning the lineage of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And as I say, if you want really support for that from someone, look no further than Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Gokashodas Babaji Maharaj, who shortly after the forming of the mission of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur passed from the world. And after having already formed a mission and his gurus passing from the world, at some point, the Thakur felt the need to function in the world visibly as a renunciate, and as such establish a sannyas order. This was an innovative insight of his, and he was looking at missions like Vivekananda's mission. Vivekananda was also a Kayasta, incidentally, and he had gone to the Americas and so forth, and received some recognition, brought recognition to Hinduism, Vedanta, and to his guru, I forget his name, maybe worth forgetting. And he saw also the Christian missionaries sending their missionary priests for canvassing and so forth. So he thought he needed canvassers and to establish an order of renunciation, to dress as in saffron and stand out in a crowd amongst white-clad Hindu and Vaishnava devotees, as for example the Shankar sannyasins would stand out and be regarded. He looked no further for the inspiration and kind of confirmation or authorization, if you will, for this innovation than Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself, who did the same thing. Granted, after the formation of the Sampradaya, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu took sannyas as a means to disseminate, to bring attention to himself in saffron, and further disseminate his teachings. granted, afterwards, his founding acharyas didn't themselves have a sannyas order, so to speak, but there were renunciates, and they had a code of conduct, if you will, and mode of dress and way of distinguishing themselves from others. But I think as much has been made out of nothing when there's an emphasis sometimes placed on the fact that under this direction of Sanatana Goswami, the architect of the Sampradaya, the members were advised to wear white. You can wear pink, blue, red, green, or yellow and chant Hare Krishna and definitely go back to Godhead. You should be sure of that. It will depend on what color cloth you wear. Anyone who thinks that has very much conflated a minor detail with the principle. However forcefully it may have been said at times in those times, perhaps for distinguishing the Gaudiya tradition from others. Now, to give emphasis to it at a time when it was not very well much appreciated, the Thakura looked to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's example and thought to implement this. And he took sannyas itself being controversial in a sense. He took it in a controversial way as well by sitting before the picture of Gorkashwar Babaji Maharaj. He said that he received the mantra in a dream. Seems unorthodox as well, controversial. Of course, it's mentioned in the Govinda Bhashya of Baldev Vijayabhusana that mantras are often imparted in dreams. So we find that in Brihad Bhagavatamrita, also the Mathura Brahman received the mantra, the Gopal mantra in a dream from Goddess Durga Devi. It worked for him. And it worked for Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura as well. Yes, it was a little out of the norm, but and where did he get permission, someone will ask, to take sannyas or to start this? Well, let me say this. No one needs permission to renounce the world. We are all implored to do so by the Gita, by the Bhagavatam, by the example of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself. No one needs permission to renounce the world. Permission is good, blessings are good, they're important, and so on and so forth, and essential in one sense, in another sense, for most people. But was it essential in a formal sense? Not that Saraswati Thakur didn't get permission from Gorkashore in a dream or through the picture and so forth, but some could question that. But obviously, well, he was a renunciate. He was a celibate, for that matter, which is an aspect of renunciation, since the time he was 17 and throughout his whole life. And he gave every drop of his blood, if you will, to the spreading of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, never deviating for a moment. So you have to look at the result. And then the formal details have to be adjusted and validated or invalidated accordingly. If he had taken sannyas from a picture and then couldn't live up to it, well, then obviously you'd say, see. But if he could, and he did, in such a way, to such an extent that that objectively speaking, I know I'm going on here a bit, so I'll try to wrap it up here for you, because I'm maybe talking a little too much, but forgive me for my enthusiasm on the occasion. But the movement of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur became known historically as the most powerful reformist movement of Vaishnavism in Bengal in the 19th and early part of the 20th century. There is a movie that was made by my godbrother Bhakti Gaurav and Sringa Maharaj and his helpers about Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And the most touching, some of you may have seen that. I think it's available on the internet. Forgive me, I don't know the title of it. but it might be a nice thing for some of you or all of you to watch today if you can. Universal Teacher, so it should be available for downloading on YouTube. Universal Teacher. The most compelling part of the movie for me was the end, where the scene was basically a train. The train going through Bengal and stopping at different stations and so forth. And that was the visual. And of course, the storyline, the narrative was that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was taken on the train, to Mayapur, where his samadhi rites were performed and so forth. And all the train stops, thousands and thousands of people came out as the news rippled through Bengal that the great Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, who added to that title, Saraswati is of course one of the 10 sannyas names given by Shankar. Bhaktisiddhanta, informing his order of sannyas, expanded the name to 108 names, maybe drawing from another text of sannyas, but Saraswati is one of them. In his formal sannyas order that he started, his custom was to give a sannyas name to a disciple, like Swami is one, Goswami is one, Sridhar is one, Saraswati is one, Aranya is one. That name, along with a 2 or 3 syllable name that characterized that particular sannyasi. So you could have Siddhanta Puri Maharaj or Bhakti Pranay Padmanabh Maharaj, or you could have another Padmanabh Maharaj or Saraswati Maharaj and so forth. So Saraswati was the sannyas name. Siddhanta is a 3-syllable name that, of course, he was given the name, as it's the title, Saraswati, Siddhanta Saraswati. He added that bhakti. So he would give sannyas and then name his sannyas disciples bhakti, 2 or 3-syllable word, Vedanta, and then the sannyas name, Swami Maharaj. That was his system. So he added bhakti to his name and referred to himself as Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. And so the news went like the coming of a tornado or a tsunami. Tsunami's coming, tsunami's coming, tsunami's coming, from village to village to village to village. And as the train stopped in each location on the way to Mayapur, thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, Bengalis, came to pay respect to the great Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. There was a ripple of, there were obstacles that he faced. There were persons who did not like him. I was criticized sometimes for my, in Prabhupada's mission, selling books in ways that agitated some people, because sometimes we were selling books in airports and the people who were working in the airports were critical of us. And Prabhupada said, if nobody is becoming disturbed, then there's no preaching. Preaching means to disturb people, stir the pot and bring out something new. So he disturbed some people. The some Gaudiyas for his critiques of his own mission, and the Varnashramis, the Smartas, and so forth. But that was a small current. The larger feeling and understanding about his mission. He opened 64 monasteries in India and sent emissaries to England and to Germany. During his manifest presence. The campaign was extraordinary. It touched so many people and brought so much dignity actually to Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Joining him were not what was more the case, I believe, prior to his contribution. Persons joining Gaudiya Vaishnavism based on their being born as Vaishnavas, or some people become monks as an excuse. Um, I'm just generalizing. Excuse not to be responsible, not to work. Um, but and there are many good people, I'm sure, joining Gaudiya Vaishnavism as well, and for the right reasons. But they weren't coming, let's say, from the Bhadra Lok. They weren't coming from educated society. They weren't coming like Sridhar Maharaj with a college degree, or Prabhupada with a college degree. Uh, they weren't like celebrated collegiate athletics like Krishnadas Babaji Maharaj, a track star. They were. It was common in the Harmonist, which was a reincarnation, in the realm of literature, of Bhaktivinoda Sajjanatoshini, edited by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura, to refer to the authors of the articles who were his disciples, often by their secular names with their letters, MB, PhD, and so forth, after it, because these were recognized in the world as, as something, and so Gaudiya Vaishnavism is being recognized by people with doctorates and college degrees and so on and so forth. This was something new, and it was. You can imagine how it was joyful and celebratory for people who were in one form or another Gaudiya Vaishnavas. I mean, to say in one form or another, they loved Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was the patron saint is this patron saint of Bengal. How far and how wide? Yes, it's true. There were misrepresentations of his teaching and so on and so forth. But and that the corrective needs to be there, and Bhaktisiddhanta was involved in that corrective in Bhaktivinoda Thakur. But anyone who's been touched by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and the ideal of his praying and had to, objectively speaking, be proud of the contribution of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, his preaching strategies, innovations, and so on and so forth. They were so successful in his time. It brought so much dignity to Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And again, that scene in the train, thousands of people, is the narrative, coming and paying respect at every train stop, as the news throughout Bengal rippled. The great Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, the great general, most powerful reformist of Gaudiya Vaishnavism in Bengal in the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, had now, his campaign, he departed from the world. Wow. This is the day that we're commemorating, to try to feel what those people felt. I mean, their tradition, their love, however perfect or imperfect it was for Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, was not something that was now something that the world was sharing and was partaking in, was trumpeting, was glorifying. And I mean, how heartening that was. How all persons touched by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu had to be, objectively speaking, proud of him. Even if he criticized them, they had to step back and say, he did something for us. He did something for Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And it was something extraordinary. And we find it, of course, even in his disappearance and his passing from the world, in the person of, in our particular group, persons of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada and Bhakti Rakshak Sridhar Goswami Maharaj, Puri Goswami Maharaj, who we've been blessed to have the association of. And it was the request of the Thakura, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, that his disciples, and it extends to us, grand disciples, great grand disciples, and so forth, to keep the current of Bhaktivinoda Thakur alive in the world, flowing in the world. So let us on this day try to appreciate what that means, and recommit ourselves to a dynamic understanding, practice, and extension and dissemination relative to our power to do so of the teachings of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Shri Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, Prabhupada ki jai, Gaur Bhakti Vrinda ki jai, Gaur Premanande. So again, I've talked for quite some time. I probably it's not good to extend the discussion further with questions, but
tomorrow. We will be meeting again tomorrow. So.
We'll meet tomorrow. So if any questions from today's discussion come up that you'd like to ask, we can incorporate it into tomorrow's question and answer session. I thank you all very much for
thank you so much.
This opportunity.
Hare Krishna.
Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, Prabhupada, Tirubhav, Hamilton, ki jai. Bhaktivinoda Parivar ki jai. Gaur Bhakti Vrinda ki jai. Gaur Premanande, Haribol.
Bhaktisiddhanta Tripurari Swami Maharaj ki jai. Haribol.